They always told me I would stop being so liberal after I learned basic economics, and, they were right. Not a liberal anymore. My goal of this channel isn't just to indoctrinate the innocent youth into my evil agenda of destroying the free market, the family, and America itself. My goal is also to educate the innocent youth about the reality of the social world we live in, so that they know why we need to destroy the free market, the family, and America itself, and what tactics to employ in order to go about that goal. And for that, we need to understand theory. Learning theory is a deeply empowering experience. It allows you to stop being a passive observer of history and instead become a participant in it. It's also one of the most exciting things I've undertaken in the past few years. A lot of things I've learned make perfect intuitive sense, and some things are more complicated. But anytime you learn something new, you start looking at the world around you in a new and interesting light. Economics, politics, simply going to the store to buy a loaf of bread, or clocking into work, what was once the humdrum of daily life is now colorful and complicated, something to be explored and studied, something with a story behind it. The story isn't always a happy one, and 9 times out of 10 it's not, but we're better off from knowing it and being able to tell it to others. Now, I can't teach you everything there is to know about Marxist theory in one video. I can't even do that in multiple videos because there's a lot of things I myself still have to learn. But I can teach you the basics. So I'm going to introduce to you the main terminology that any aspiring theorist needs to know. The jargon, the lingo. So when you yourself start reading theory, you'll have a basic understanding of what the author is talking about. And being able to identify and name different concepts and phenomena is the first step to understanding them. Some caveats. I'm going to be using the definitions of terms as Marxists use them. You'll probably meet plenty of non-Marxists who take objection to these definitions. But since it is possible for one word to have different definitions in different contexts, I'm not going to go out of my way to debunk alternative definitions. The important thing is for you to understand the definitions as we use them, so that you can understand what we're talking about when you read our books, or in this case, watch our videos. Also, a lot of the concepts I'm going to introduce to you, I have to simplify them down so that we can fit them into a single video. So if it sounds like I'm making an overgeneralization or ignoring nuance, it's because I have to for the sake of time. You should take this video as a launching off point for further reading and further learning. It's not going to make you an expert theoretician. So buckle up, comrades, it's learning time. Oh my god, I can't believe I just said that. That's so cringe. Whatever, let's get started. So how about we start at the top? What is Marxism? Marxism is an intellectual tradition and long-running political movement based on the theories and writings of Karl Marx. Although Marx was the founder of Marxism, many other intellectuals, political leaders, and revolutionaries have expanded upon and improved upon his work. It's an entire intellectual discipline with all the same complexities as physics and chemistry. Just like physicists and chemists, Marxists argue with each other. They come up with theories and hypotheses to explain things they see in the real world, and they update their theories in response to new knowledge and closer analyses. The intellectual goal of Marxist theory is to answer questions in the social sciences, history, politics, economics, etc., to explain the social reality of our lives. The political goal of Marxism is to dismantle class-based society by putting the means of production in the hands of the working class. It may seem strange to combine the goal of intellectual analysis with a specific political end goal, but if you think about it, no science can be completely 100% objective. All science is undertaken with a predetermined end goal in mind. Ecologists study ecology in order to better protect the natural environment. Rocket scientists study rockets so that we may one day travel to Mars. and Marxists study our social reality in order to create a more prosperous, just, and egalitarian world. Some features of Marxist theory include using dialectical materialism as an analytical framework, examining class divisions in order to understand the mechanics of how society functions, as well as studying the history of working class movements and applying that practical knowledge to current political struggles. Dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is a philosophical idea developed by Karl Marx. It's a logical method, a framework through which we can examine the world around us and answer questions about what we see. The main idea of dialectical materialism is that the world is a material place governed by material forces, where the things that happen have material causes and effects. And those material forces are in a constant state of internal conflict and paradox and contradiction, which means that whatever system we study is going to be dynamic and ever-changing. Materialism is the idea that the world we see in front of us, that we can observe either directly with our senses or indirectly with instruments, that's the world. There's no secret higher dimension acting upon us invisibly. There's no spirit world or supernatural forces. Hurricanes don't happen because we angered the gods. Mental illness isn't caused by demonic possession, and the market is not actually guided by an invisible hand. Things we see around us have material causes and material effects. Dialectics is the idea that the universe is in a constant state of dialogue with itself, that it's filled with internal contradicting forces and paradoxes and tensions, which eventually demand resolution. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. These internal contradictions can be found in any system, from the molecules in a glass of water to the universe as a whole, and of course to human society. As a result, the world is an ever-changing, dynamic, and often very confusing place. Let's take a look at an example. So if you heat up a pot of water, the water molecules are suffering a contradiction between the heat that would make them fly off and escape and the hydrogen bonds holding the water molecules together in a liquid state. Those hydrogen bonds are why water has a much higher boiling point than other substances of similar molecular weight. I went to school for biology. But if you add enough heat, this quantitative change in energy becomes a qualitative change of state. The contradiction suddenly and quite dramatically resolves itself, and the whole pot boils over. Historical materialism. Historical materialism is dialectical materialism applied to the study of history. Many people think the social sciences don't count as real science, because they falsely believe that our social world is not a material one. They think that our history, our economy, our politics, our culture are immaterial abstract things that spring purely from human minds. Surely they can't be material the same way a biological organism or a chemical reaction is material, right? The truth is, of course, our social world is profoundly material. Our social world has us, and we are material creatures of flesh and blood who interact with other flesh and blood humans, who have very real material needs, make a very real material impact on the world around us. Yeah, you do have free will, but every choice you make is in response to the material world around you. Yeah, your beliefs and morals, which guide your behavior, exist inside your head, but your head is a physical part of your body. Your ideology is simply the way your brain processes the material reality of your life, and you formed your ideology in response to your lived material experiences. And that's true for every other person on Earth as well. And with 7 billion Earthlings all exercising free will and coming up with ideas at the same time, we start to see concrete, predictable patterns emerging, which have obvious material causes and obvious material effects, and follow particular rules. We can understand things that happen in history by looking at material forces. For example, we can see that capitalism evolved out of feudalism because the European economy became much more productive and technologically advanced, and feudalism doesn't really have a system to manage any type of industry besides agriculture. The material mode of production changed, and thus so did the mode of production. We can also understand the conflicts that drive human history by looking at the material incentives of the people involved. And our material incentives are directly related to our class, which is why we say all hitherto recorded history is the history of class conflict. For example, we see how Southern American plantation owners feared that they would lose their profits and status if the American government banned slavery, so they seceded, starting the Civil War. Means of production. So in order for humans to live and have happy, healthy, productive lives, we have to work. We need to make food, clothes, medicine, chairs, knockoff designer handbags, and internet memes. We also need to transport and distribute those goods and services to the people who need and want them. That's production. The means of production are all of the material things we need to do our production. The facilities, infrastructure, land, tools, factories, office buildings, internet servers, Walmart supercenters, as well as trucks, tractors, and machines that go brrrr. The means of production of our modern economy, which is wealthy, technologically advanced, and well organized, are very different than the means of production we had 200 years ago, and more different still than the ones we had 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. As such, the way our economy works and the social relations that govern our society have also greatly changed. Mode of production. The mode of production is the set of rules and social relations that govern how any society goes about the daily business of having an economy. How we organize and plan labor, how we compensate labor if it is compensated at all, and how the products of labor are distributed. Modes of production go along hand in hand with the means of production, and whatever means of production our society has at our particular stage of development, that will shape the mode of production we operate under. Throughout most of human history, the only means of production humans had were whatever they could find in nature. Society's productive capacity was very low. People had to operate in small family groups in a highly communal and egalitarian manner, what Marx called primitive communism. However, when humans domesticated animals and learned how to grow crops, we could produce a surplus for the first time. This meant that some people could exempt themselves from doing hands-on productive labor, and we had a ruling class. There are many different types of class-based modes of production. There's slavery, where the ruling class owns the workers as well as the means of production. There's feudalism, where the ruling class owns land and the working class people are just seen as being attached to the land. And of course, there's capitalism, where the ruling class owns the means of production and hires wage laborers to do work on the means of production. Over time, societies will transition from one mode of production to another as they develop their economies. But this process is often messy and alinear. For example, capitalism began in Europe in the late Middle Ages, but it took hundreds of years for capitalism to truly replace feudalism. It's also possible for one society to have multiple modes of production going on at the same time. Capitalism. A lot of people think of capitalism as being the same thing as the ability to start a business enterprise or the ability to buy and sell goods on a market. But those are things that exist in non-capitalist societies too. Capitalism itself is a lot more complicated. Capitalism is a mode of production that evolved out of European feudalism in the late Middle Ages. Capitalist economies often have a very high productive capacity, but a big inequality between the rich and the poor. They are often industrialized and tend to unite large networks of producers and consumers on an international scale. A capitalist mode of production has a few key identifying features. The first is the predominance of commodity production. production for the purposes of sale instead of the purpose of direct use. Throughout most of human history, most things that were made were used by the people who made them or by their community. But in capitalism, people rarely make things that they use themselves. Instead, we sell everything we make and buy everything we use. The second key feature is the practice of private property ownership. Like commodity production, private property existed before capitalism. But capitalism is unusual in that essentially everything is owned by some entity or another. Even public property is technically owned by the state, who has the same rights to it that a private owner would have. Before capitalism, in medieval Europe, peasants grew their own crops or raised their own livestock on large plots of commonly owned land. As Europe transitioned into capitalism, these common lands underwent a process of enclosure. Land was snatched up by wealthy landlords, and peasants were displaced and forced out of their homes and into cities, where they had no choice but to become proletarians. Capitalism is also unusual in the large variety of different things that people can own as private property. People nowadays can get rich off of owning nothing but quote-unquote intellectual property, or owning financial assets, which aren't even real property, just money, just a generalized right to a certain portion of the economy as a whole. And the third and most important key feature of capitalism is wage labor, where a person who owns means of production hires someone else to work on those means of production, paying them at a certain rate for their time and effort. Wage labor existed before capitalism, but most working class people either only worked wage labor part-time or didn't work wage labor at all. It isn't until we reach capitalism that wage labor becomes the primary way that working class people make a living. In a capitalist mode of production, the ruling class, who we will call the bourgeoisie, get their power from the fact they legally own the means of production. The bourgeoisie hire wage laborers, who we will call the proletariat, to do work on those means of production. The bourgeois capitalist buys the proletarian's labor power as a commodity, then takes the product of the proletarian's labor and sells it as a commodity, keeping the surplus value for himself. Socialism. Capitalism is a system where the means of production are privately owned by the bourgeoisie, who use their privilege of ownership to make a profit off of other people's labor. Capitalism is a class-based society. A socialist mode of production is one in which the proletariat takes control, throws out the bourgeoisie, and owns and runs the means of production themselves. The proletariat are no longer exploited, but are now themselves the ruling class. And since the proletariat now own the means of production, and also the proletariat are the majority of the population, this also means we can say that the means of production are owned publicly. Socialist ideology is the belief that society should operate under a socialist mode of production. Sometimes you will meet people who call themselves socialist, but do not advocate for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, who instead want to increase the portion of the economy that is in public ownership, such as by having the bourgeois state nationalize certain industries, or simply aggressively taxing the bourgeoisie. I would argue that such people are using the term socialist incorrectly, and a more accurate term for such people would be social democrat or progressive. Communism. A communist society is one in which all class divisions have been completely erased. This is only possible in a world in which our productive forces are very well developed, to the point where the things we need and want are so plentiful and easy to make, it no longer makes any sense to try and buy and sell them or to worry about how we will distribute them. A communist society has no need for money, no need for a state, and no class divisions. A communist society would be gradually built out of a socialist society. Communist ideology is the belief that society should operate under a communist mode of production. Since communism, by default, means that the people who work on the means of production also own the means of production, and since a communist society would be built out of a socialist society, all communists are also socialists. Countries that we call communist are actually socialist countries. These are countries where the working class has taken power, but none of them have evolved into stateless, classless, moneyless societies. This evolutionary process would realistically take many generations. However, the governing bodies of these socialist countries are run by leaders who are ideologically communist, because they want to work toward the goal of building a communist society. Note: Karl Marx used the term communism to refer to both socialism and communism. Marx called them lower phase communism and higher phase communism. It was Lenin who decided to call them socialism and communism. Marx called himself a communist to distance himself from the ideologies of other people of his time who called themselves socialists. Class. Often when we use the term class in general conversation, we think of people's income. And while income is definitely a useful metric for answering some questions in the social sciences, it can't really help us understand the mechanics of how the economy functions. For Marxists, class isn't how much money you make, it's how you make your money, if money is even a feature of your society's mode of production. A person's class, in the Marxist sense, is how a person relates to the means of production. If a society has enough productive capacity to produce surplus food, this means you can have some people who no longer have to spend their time on producing food and can go do other types of work. It means more complex and drastic division of labor. So you have different groups of people, different classes of people, who relate to the means of production in different ways. There are some people who work directly with their hands on the means of production. Other people who boss around the people who work with their hands on the means of production. And others still who sit in back offices adding up numbers to keep track of all the different things that are produced. All of these people have different rules they have to follow, different hierarchies they fit into, and systems of how they relate to one another. Those rules and systems constitute the mode of production. But in all class-based modes of production, you will have at least one class of people who actually do hands-on productive labor, and another class of people who control and exploit those who do productive labor, taking the surplus product for themselves. Class conflict. Class conflict is when different classes fight over conflicting material interests, jostling for control of the economy and over political power. In class-based society, different classes relate to the means of production in different ways, which means they live under different material conditions and thus have conflicting material interests. These conflicting interests are often fundamentally irreconcilable. As long as there are different classes, there will also be class conflict. Class conflict drives the drama of politics and history, and you can understand political conflicts by looking at the class identities of various different actors. Class conflict can take the form of minor disputes and scuffles, or it can result in full-out war or revolution. Let's look at an example from capitalism. Proletarians are, by necessity, paid less than the value of the work they produce, which is how the bourgeois boss makes a profit. To raise the workers' wages, the boss has to cut into their profit. If the boss wants a higher profit, he has to lower the workers' wages, or lower the workers' relative wages by demanding more work for the same amount of money. There is a fundamental, irreconcilable conflict of interest between these two parties, and no way to settle the conflict without someone having to give something up. This makes it very difficult for workers to get wage increases by asking for them. If the workers want a raise, they have to unionize and maybe even go on strike. The boss tries to stop this by spying on workers, firing ringleaders, or spreading anti-union propaganda. The boss may even send the police or hired thugs to break up a strike. This is serious business. Class conflict occurs outside of the workplace too. Proletarians from the whole community will organize to demand political concessions from the entire ruling class. Sometimes, if conditions are right and the proletariat is angry enough, they overthrow the ruling class in a revolution. And it's fucking awesome. Class conflict is not just limited to the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Any two classes can fight over conflicts of interest. For example, the French Revolution was a struggle between the bourgeoisie and the old feudal aristocracy. Sometimes there are even fights between different segments of the same class. If you haven't noticed, the bourgeoisie is constantly fighting amongst itself. Class analysis. Class analysis is the attempt to understand history and politics by looking closely at class conflict and the class identities of different key actors. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. If we imagine the world as a physical place, and a physical place that is in a constant state of internal conflict and thus evolution and movement, and we apply that thinking to the social sciences, we get a picture of society in our head as a complex machine with many moving parts interacting with one another, sometimes harmonious, but also grinding against each other, wearing down each other's surfaces whenever the oil runs dry. These different moving parts are classes. Different classes have competing material interests. For example, you, a proletarian, want to work as little as possible for as much pay as possible, and your bourgeois boss wants the exact opposite, for you to work as much as possible for as little pay as possible. These conflicting interests have profound political implications. For example, people with proletarian jobs are much more likely to support a law raising the minimum wage than bourgeois business owners. Research shows that material conditions of a person's life, especially income, which is related to class, have substantial effects on how they vote. And with class conflict in mind, we can unravel a lot of mysteries about how society functions and why political and historical events play out the way they do. Class analysis takes a look at specific events or phenomena, looks at the class identity of the different participating actors, considers those people's material incentives, and comes up with an explanation based on that information. Proletariat. A proletarian is a wage laborer, someone who doesn't own any means of production, and so they have no way of supporting themselves by working independently. Instead, in order to work and make a living, they have to sell their labor power, sell their ability to work, sell hours of their life to someone who does own the means of production. They get to keep the wages, and the business owner gets to keep the products of the proletarian's labor. The proletarian is, by necessity, paid less than the value of the work they do. If they were paid the same, the business owner would not make a profit from hiring the proletarian. But proletarians accept this raw deal because of two reasons. One, they don't often know how much they're truly producing due to being alienated from their labor, and two, they have no choice. They own no means of production, and thus they can't work independently. And this is the only way they have to legally make a living. Often you will hear the proletariat class called the working class, and proletarians called workers, though the terms working class and worker sometimes refer to people who are not technically wage laborers, but who do perform productive hands-on labor. The proletariat is not a monolithic class, and it can sometimes be hazy knowing who does and doesn't count as a proletarian. This is because there are many, many ways that labor can be organized, planned, and compensated. And as our economy grows and evolves, we're going to see new types of work and new types of workers. For example, there are the gig economy workers on one end and the professional managerial class on the other, people who are workers, but who are sometimes considered separate classes from the traditional proletariat. There are also vast inequalities between workers. A person with a union job in Scandinavia lives a very different life than a prison worker in Louisiana or a sweatshop worker in Thailand. The labor aristocracy versus the hyper-exploited underclasses. Bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are the capitalist class, business owners, those who own the means of production. Sometimes you will hear them referred to as capitalists, or sometimes even just the ruling class. The bourgeoisie extract profit from the means of production, which they own, by hiring proletarians to work on those means of production. They take the proletarians' labor, sell it, and then keep the profits for themselves. In a developed capitalist economy, the bourgeoisie are the ruling class. They, compared to other economic classes, exert the most social and political influence on the government and on the culture. The wealthiest people in the world at this point in history are bourgeois. Usually when we say bourgeoisie, we aren't just counting people who own businesses and hire wage laborers. We also count anyone else who makes a living investing capital, such as by owning financial assets or rental property. The bourgeoisie are not a monolithic class. There are the big bourgeoisie, the elites, the super wealthy, the movers and shakers of the economy. But there are also the petty bourgeoisie, those who own some means of production but are not necessarily rich. The petty bourgeoisie are people whom we might colloquially call small business owners. Some people may own enough means of production that they can extract profit from other people's labor, but not a whole lot. The term bourgeois can refer to a single member of the bourgeoisie, but it can also be an adjective to describe things that were created by the bourgeoisie for their own purposes. You might occasionally hear me use terms like bourgeois revolution or bourgeois state. Labor power is a worker's ability to work. Now, this one was tricky for me to wrap my head around when I started learning Marxist theory, but it's a pretty important term. When workers get hired by a capitalist, they are not selling their labor. They are selling their labor power. The worker doesn't sell their labor because they never own their labor. In fact, the boss is the one who gets the privilege of selling that labor. So what's the difference between labor and labor power? Your labor is what you do. It's what you make or the service you perform. Your labor power is your capacity to work. So how do I know that I, a proletarian, am selling labor power and not labor? Well, because my pay doesn't change in step with the amount of labor that I do. I used to work as a janitor at a store that rhymes with the word malwart. I got paid $12 an hour to clean bathrooms. $12 an hour. Now, let's say I go to work and I have a very productive day. Let's say I clean all of the bathrooms in an hour, the break room twice, do a trash run, wipe down the computer room, even maybe pick up some trash from the outside. That's a lot of labor. But how much do I get paid for it? $12 an hour. Now, let's say I go to work and have a very lazy day. I wipe down all the tables in the break room and then spend the rest of the shift hiding in a closet. I'm not afraid of getting fired because nobody really paid attention to what I did. How much do I get paid then? $12 an hour. And even if they did fire me, they would still be required to pay me that $12 an hour for the time I was clocked in, regardless of what I had or hadn't accomplished. The hours are what I sell, not the work. I sell the capitalist my life force, bits and pieces of my life itself, my hands and my body and my brain and my time. And my boss does his best to ride my ass and crack the whip and extract as much labor as he can from me in that time. Commodity. A commodity is any item made with human labor which can be bought or sold. Commodities are defined partly by their value. Capitalism is unique from previous modes of production in that the vast majority of items produced get sold on the market. We sell pretty much everything we make and buy pretty much everything we use. In the old-timey times, Most people made things for direct use, either for themselves or for their families and communities. Only surplus product was sold, and most people only bought things they really, really needed and really, really couldn't make at home. As our economy's productive capacity increased, however, this increased the amount of surplus product. It also increased division of labor because fewer workers were needed for food production. Thus, by the time feudalism turns into capitalism, the market becomes an ever-present reality of our lives. Value. All commodities have an overall value, which is the average socially necessary labor time needed to produce that commodity, a use value, the benefit we get from using or owning that commodity, and an exchange value, the rate at which one commodity can be traded for other commodities. Overall value. Different commodities require more of society's time and resources to produce than others. A car requires many hours of labor to make, with hundreds and hundreds of workers, whereas a t-shirt is a simple object made from easily produced raw materials. Therefore, cars are more difficult to produce and more difficult to acquire, and thus a car behaves very differently on the market than a t-shirt does. Use value. Use value is difficult to quantify and is often subjective. But no one makes commodities that aren't useful in some capacity. And if they do, they go out of business due to no one buying those things. Items that require a lot of labor don't necessarily have higher use value than items that are made easily. However, use value is still produced through labor. For example, a chair is much more useful than a pile of timber, and the only difference between the timber and a chair is labor. Exchange value. A commodity's exchange value is the ratio at which it can be traded for other commodities. This is easily quantifiable and is deeply reflective of the amount of labor a commodity requires for production. For example, I can trade approximately 2,000 t-shirts for one new car, partially due to the fact it takes approximately 2,000 times as much labor to produce a car than it does a t-shirt. Exchange value is not to be confused with price. Price is just the amount of money the buyer and seller decide to exchange for an item, and it is set arbitrarily by the parties involved. Price is related to exchange value, but it's only an estimate of exchange value. Price fluctuates up and down in response to supply and demand. We can think of exchange value as being the average price of a commodity over long periods of time. The labor theory of value. The labor theory of value states that human labor, with or without the use of tools or machines, is the only thing capable of producing value, and that the value of a commodity is equal to the average socially necessary labor time needed to produce such a commodity. Point number 1. While not all labor produces value at an equal rate, labor is the only thing capable of producing value. Only human labor can take near worthless raw materials and turn them into useful goods and services. Things do not magically become more valuable because we sell them at a higher price or because we imagine them to be valuable. And also, only the products of labor can be said to be valuable, with perhaps the exception of resources produced by nature. The world's wealth exists in the forms of material goods and services. Money is not valuable. Money is only a system we use to keep track of who is entitled to what portion of the material wealth on the market at any given point. So you can't generate value by printing money, collecting interest, or charging rent. Point number 2. The amount of labor that goes into a commodity determines its value. We can observe this by looking at the prices of different commodities on the market. Price and value are of course not the same thing, but as price fluctuates up and down, it always oscillates around value. We know that price is controlled by supply and demand. Price will go up or down until an equilibrium between supply and demand is reached.
This equilibrium price settles in a particular range for particular types of commodities. For example, a box of crackers typically costs around $3, and a poor quality laptop usually costs around $300. Sometimes you see crackers for $2 or laptops for $500. But why those price ranges, though? How come we don't see many $300 cracker boxes or $3 laptops? Well, different commodities each have an average cost of production. If a capitalist charges a price too high above the average production cost, he's going to be outcompeted by other capitalists, and his product won't sell. If the capitalist charges too low a price, he won't be able to recover the cost of production. Therefore, in any reasonably competitive market, the price of a commodity always oscillates around its cost of production. And what determines cost of production? The average socially necessary labor time to produce a commodity. The amount of work needed to go from raw materials to a finished product. A laptop requires very intense labor to produce. It's made of rare earth minerals that are hard to mine. It has hundreds of microscopic parts that need to be cut and formed and assembled, so laptops are expensive. Crackers are easy to produce. They're made of mostly wheat, something humans learned how to grow thousands of years ago, which can be produced in enormous volumes thanks to modern farm technology. Crackers are cheap. It's important to note, if you buy a box of crackers for $3, it doesn't mean that $3 exactly worth of labor went into that box of crackers. It doesn't even mean that $3 worth of labor went into the average box of crackers from that factory. It just means that the average box of crackers on the market requires around $3 worth of labor, which means that $3 is a price that the capitalist can charge and get away with. Surplus value. In class-based societies, working-class people have to do two types of work: work to sustain themselves and work to sustain the ruling class. Slaves grow their own food, sew their own clothes, and build their own shelters, or produce work that can be traded for those things that they need. But then they also have to grow food, sew clothes, and build houses for their master, or produce work that can be traded for the things the master needs. If they do not produce for their master, they are punished with violence. A serf spends a few days toiling a week on their own field to feed their own family and community. But then they also have to spend a few days a week toiling on their landlord's field, or pay rent by giving the landlord a portion of their harvest. If they don't do this, they are punished with violence. Proletarians labor part of the day to cover the cost of their own wages, but then they labor the rest of the day producing goods and services their boss sells at a profit, minus, of course, the cost for the upkeep of the business. The difference between the price your boss pays for your labor power and the money your boss makes off the work you do, that's surplus value. Your boss's profits come from your work. They can't come from anywhere else besides your work, because work is the only thing capable of producing value. Your boss probably works too. He does administrative labor, and if it's a small business, he might even do the exact same type of work you do. But his income doesn't just come from the sale of his own work. It also comes from selling your work too. If he didn't make a profit off of your work, he wouldn't keep you around.
There are several different things that a boss can do to extract extra surplus value from their workers. The first is to extend the length of the working day, increasing the amount of time the worker can spend creating surplus after working off the cost of their wages. Even if we assume that the worker's hourly wage stays the same, and the boss has to pay a slightly higher amount in wages by giving the worker more hours, this still increases profit, because the extra work done in those hours more than covers the cost of extra wages paid. The other thing the boss can do is to decrease the amount of time it takes for the worker to work off the cost of their wages. The easiest way to do that is, of course, to lower wages. But the boss can also force workers to work harder and faster, to extract as much value out of that worker every hour that they can. Think about those stories of Amazon warehouse workers wearing tracking bracelets on their wrists and not being allowed enough time to use the restroom. But even the most dedicated worker, or terrified one, can only increase their productivity by a certain amount. Eventually, they run up against their own human limitations. The boss can get around this problem by buying machinery and technology to speed up the productive process.
Capital. Capital is money you spend in order to make more money at a profit. This simple statement contains within it 3 ideas we have to understand. 1. Capital is money. Not all economies use money. For various reasons, only economies with high productive capacity use money, and only under capitalism is money the primary mode of exchange. 2. Not all money is capital. It's only capital if we spend it with the intention of turning it back into money. If you buy an item for your own personal use, that's just money. If you buy something you plan to sell or transform and then sell, it might be capital. Drug dealers know better than to dip into their own product. If you buy drugs to use them, you spend money. If you buy drugs to sell them, you spend capital. 3. Capital isn't just money we intend to turn back into money, but into more money. Capital is money spent with the intention of making a profit. So, how does one spend their capital if they wish to make a profit? Well, one thing you can do is buy some commodities and resell them at a higher price. But this business model isn't really sustainable in the long term, because selling things at a higher price doesn't produce any new value. It only expropriates value currently on the market. Price and value are not the same thing, and the same item sold at different prices is equally valuable. If we want to create new value, we have to transform the things that we buy. We need to buy something dynamic, something that can be turned into something else more valuable. We could buy some means of production, but here's the thing. Factories, raw materials, machines that go brrrr, those are inanimate objects. They can't produce new value on their own. We need human beings to do work on those means of production in order to create valuable things from them. As we explained before, human labor is the only thing capable of creating value. If you are a small business owner, maybe you can do that productive labor yourself. But if you want to get rich, you need to hire wage laborers. You need to buy human labor power. There is only one commodity that capital can buy, which is truly capable of producing something more valuable than itself, and that is labor power. Money. Money is the lord of all commodities, the meta-commodity, the commodity against which all other commodities are measured. Its use value and its exchange value are one and the same, yet it has no independent value of its own. Not all economies use money. We only really start seeing money in economies with very high productive capacity, where enough surplus is produced that trade can happen in high volumes. And it isn't until we get to capitalism that money starts to completely predominate economic life. Trade begins with people directly exchanging one commodity for another. However, if there's one particular item a large number of people want, people start comparing all other commodities to that one, even if indirectly. For example, in old-timey Europe, cattle were the universal commodity. People measured their wealth in cattle, and cattle were used in most important exchanges. In fact, the word fee actually comes from the Old English word for cattle. Precious metals make particularly convenient universal commodities. They require intensive labor to mine and refine, and so they contain a lot of value in a small volume, making it easy to transport and store large amounts of value. They also can be melted and cut and molded, so it can be broken up into the precise amounts needed for exchange. However, as the economy grows and exchange happens in higher volumes and faster rates, more money needs to be produced. We start seeing paper notes that correspond to gold and silver locked away in banks, and then just paper notes, and then just blips on computer hard drives. Unlike cows or precious metals, money nowadays requires little to no labor to produce and has no value outside of its exchange value. So it's important to remember that money has no independent value. Money is just a social construct we use to keep track of who is entitled to what portion of the actual value that exists on the market at any given point in the form of goods and services. But a lot of people still think that money and wealth are one and the same. Even people with formal economics training think that the government can solve its economic problems by printing money. This doesn't produce value. It just creates larger amounts of money to represent the same value, making each dollar worth less in the process. A lot of people also think you can produce value through the act of investment and collecting interest, or by buying something and selling it at a higher price. But doing things just to get more money doesn't produce new value because it doesn't make any valuable goods or services. In fact, it doesn't even make more money, it just appropriates money currently on the market. If you see the world through a materialist perspective, you come to understand that it is only labor that produces value, and only the products of labor can truly be viewed as valuable. And moving forward, in order to transform society from capitalism into socialism, we can't just do that by taxing the rich and taking their money. We have to take away their physical wealth that allows them to exert power over other people. We have to seize the means of production and bring them under democratic control.
Wages. Wages are the market price for labor power. The price at which you, a worker, can sell your ability to work. Labor power is a commodity, and like all commodities, it has an exchange value. And the rules that govern the value of labor power are the exact same rules that govern the value of all other commodities. And as we discussed in our segment on the labor theory of value, the average price of a commodity will always oscillate above and below its cost of production, which means wages will oscillate above and below the cost of living. The value of a worker's labor power comes from the average socially necessary labor time needed to produce a worker. You, a worker, require labor to produce. Someone had to grow your food, someone had to build your house, someone had to sew your clothes and educate you and raise you up from a baby and tuck you in at night. You have a cost of production, which we might call the cost of living. It's important to note the value of labor power doesn't just have to cover the cost of one worker. It has to cover the worker's family as well. The cost of production of labor power means the cost of upkeep for the working class as a whole. If workers can't have and raise children, you run out of workers. It's also worth noting that the cost of production is not the same for all workers. Highly skilled workers require more labor to produce. They take longer to mature before they can enter the workforce, and they also require a lot of education. Higher production cost means a higher exchange value, which usually means a high price. Bourgeois propagandists will have you believe that skilled workers receive higher wages because they are somehow better or more deserving, or they have earned it through some type of moral superiority. But the reason they get higher wages is because of amoral market forces, because the bosses are forced to pay higher wages. These workers often do indeed have a higher cost of living due to being burdened with student loans. But even skilled workers sometimes are forced to accept breadcrumbs, because wages are a price, not a value. Wages fluctuate with supply and demand. During times when the demand for labor is very high, wages can jump high above the cost of living. But when unemployment is rampant, such as when capitalism is in a crisis, and workers have to compete intensely for jobs, wages can stagnate and drop far below the cost of living.
Bosses will never pay us more than they absolutely have to get us to come back to work. If the market gives them an excuse to cut wages, they most certainly will. And the only thing that might stop them is us. So, join a goddamn labor union. Alienation of labor. Alienation of labor refers to the fact that proletarians do not own the work they produce. You sell your boss your labor power, but all of the labor you produce belongs to your boss. If you work at a factory making widgets, all the widgets you make have to stay at the factory. If you take one of those widgets home, you're a thief, even though you made the widgets. You don't know what happens to your work. You have no control over what happens to it. Most likely, you're only one part of a very long productive process, and you might not even get to see the finished product or meet the workers who do the other steps. This alienation has a profound psychological impact on workers. It makes work seem boring, even humiliating and degrading. We don't get to see the positive effect our work has on the world. We don't even get to keep the profits from the sale of that work. There are other forms of capitalist alienation too. Capitalism alienates us from our communities. It forces workers to compete instead of cooperate. Proletarians live in a state of precarity and instability. We are uprooted from our communities, making it hard to form and keep relationships. Capitalism alienates us from our humanity. Work, if you think about it, is what makes us human. The ability to work creatively, modify our environment, and make highly complex tools separates us humans from other animals. Work can fulfill us and give meaning to our lives, allow us to express ourselves. But wage labor feels the exact opposite. It leaves us feeling empty instead of fulfilled, dehumanized instead of human. In fact, doing wage labor might make you feel less human than you ever feel. Of course, some workers do find satisfaction in wage labor jobs, but most people who work wage labor hate the experience. And whether you like your job or not doesn't change the fact that you don't own the work you produce. Commodity fetishism. Fetishism, in old-timey times, referred to religious beliefs where people worshipped inanimate objects or assumed objects to have supernatural properties or powers, like believing that holy relics could heal the sick. Commodity fetishism is a feature of capitalist culture where we forget the social nature of the economy. Instead, we project those social factors onto commodities themselves. For example, assuming the value of a commodity is a property of the commodity itself. Material relations among people are replaced with social relations among things. It's very easy to forget the social nature of the economy. No direct human interaction is involved with buying a soda pop from a vending machine or paying for groceries at the self-checkout. But producing, buying, and selling things is a profoundly social process. We live in a society. This sausage egg McMuffin I just ate, en route from raw materials to my grabbing it through the drive-thru window, passed through the hands of maybe hundreds of workers. Pork farmers and cow farmers and chicken farmers and wheat farmers and yellow wrapping paper farmers. All of those farmers had names and faces and hopes and dreams. But because workers are alienated from their labor, I never got to meet any of them. And so when I see the Egg McMuffin on the menu, my attention is focused only on the McMuffin, not the people behind it. The $2.50 I paid for the McMuffin is an estimation of the amount of labor that went into the muffin. I pay the money so as to compensate the various workers up the chain of production, with a little extra so the capitalists can skim some off the top. But since I never met those people, I start imagining the $2.50 as being a property of the McMuffin itself, as if I could cut the McMuffin open and see $2.50 baked into the bun. Or like the McMuffin has a $2.50 soul, which goes to heaven when I eat the McMuffin. I also start imagining the McMuffin in a social context with other commodities, with complex hierarchical and interdependent relationships. I compared the $2.50 I paid for the McMuffin with the $3 a similar sandwich cost at Dunkin' Donuts, or the approximately 15 minutes of labor power I had to sell to get that $2.50, or the $900 I'm saving up for a new laptop, which makes me feel guilty for buying the McMuffin instead of making breakfast at home. No wonder people think of the economy in such antisocial terms. No wonder we get Margaret Thatcher saying stupid shit like, "There is no society, only individuals and families." Crisis of overproduction. A crisis of overproduction is the same thing as an economic recession or depression. One problem unique to capitalist economies is the cyclical reappearance of crises. This happens because goods and services are produced far in excess of what consumers in the market can buy. Why is this? Well, it has to do with two major features of capitalist economies: commodity production and wage labor. The predominance of commodity production means that every product, as it passes between producers and consumers, has to go through the market. The result is that producers and consumers are not in communication. They don't plan or coordinate what gets produced and how it's distributed, and producers often miscalculate demand. However, even if capitalists knew exactly how much product consumers wanted to buy, this doesn't mean consumers would have the money to buy it. Which brings us to problem number 2, wage labor. Wage labor causes recessions because proletarians, by necessity, are paid less than the market value of the work they produce. Every proletarian is paid this way, and every capitalist enterprise operates this way. This means that at any given point, the amount of money in the pockets of working class people is far less than the value of goods and services available for sale on the market. And since most commodities are marketed toward the working class, you can see how this becomes a problem. It can be difficult for capitalists to sell all the product they make, and if they don't, they can't recover the cost of production, which means they go out of business or cut way back on production and investment. They lay off workers and stop investing capital. Cash-strapped, unemployed workers and the lack of investment means that other capitalists are less likely to be able to sell their products. A vicious cycle of profit loss, decrease in production, and unemployment. This continues until all unsold product is either sold or destroyed. There are plenty of things that capitalists do to sidestep the problem of overproduction. They escape saturated markets at home and expand into new markets in other regions. They create systems of credit and finance, which lets working class consumers spend money they don't have and helps capitalists get through periods of low profit. They also reinvest their profits, creating new markets of things capitalists sell to other capitalists, and not to working class consumers. Of course, reinvestment has its own problems, because as capitalists spend more and more money on machines and technology and things to advance the production process, they start spending less and less on hiring workers. Since only workers can produce new value, and since this leaves many workers, and thus working class consumers, unemployed, we get this tendency for the rate of profit to fall. These tricks don't solve the problem of overproduction, especially since they tend to increase productive capacity. The crisis can only be delayed, not avoided. And eventually, the whole shit show comes crashing in on itself. The reserve army of labor. This term describes the mass of unemployed workers, which we find in every capitalist economy. Capitalist economies have an extremely high productive capacity, so for the first time in human history, we have more workers around than work that actually needs done. The amount of work necessary to provide for human needs is actually pretty small. The fact that so many people are employed full-time is why capitalism keeps having crises of overproduction. This means that we have some workers who can sit idle at home without society collapsing from neglect. The unemployed, contrary to bourgeois propaganda, are not lazy moochers taking advantage of the system. The material reality of life for an unemployed worker is actually a pretty dark one, marked by poverty and precarity. The truth is, the ruling class benefits greatly from having a large population of unemployed workers. There are several reasons why this is. The first is, due to the laws of supply and demand, unemployed workers lower wages because workers have to compete for work. Second, if capitalists want to expand their business rapidly, they have no trouble finding workers to hire. This is why the unemployed are called the reserve army of labor. 3. For various different reasons, it's cheaper to hire a few employees to work long shifts than it is to hire many employees to work short shifts. Shift changes disrupt the production process. The hiring and training process costs money. Each worker must be supplied with tools and a uniform. The exception is perhaps in places where the law mandates certain benefits for full-time workers. The fourth and most important reason is that the threat of unemployment gives bosses tyrannical control over workers' lives. Proletarians have no way of accessing the means of production and make a living except for wage labor. Their boss is the main thread tying them to the rest of the economy, and at any point, the boss is free to sever that thread, cutting workers off from access to their basic needs. Anyone who's worked wage labor knows how serious this threat can be and the psychological terror it instills. When you consider that workers have to compete with one another for jobs, the threat becomes even more terrifying, since it makes unemployment difficult to escape. This competition also makes it extremely difficult for a worker to walk away and find a new job if their boss mistreats them, relieving the boss of any accountability. A guarantee of employment would put enormous power in the hands of working-class people, which is why socialist organizations usually list it as one of their demands. The state. States are what we might colloquially refer to as the government, and even I sometimes mix the terms up, but they are not the same thing. In short, governments are how we make laws. The state is the institution which enforces the law. More specifically, states are armed bodies of men which rise out of society, though seemingly exist outside and above society, which exist for the purpose of allowing one class to control and suppress another class. Let's look at the different aspects of this latter definition one at a time. First of all, states are armed bodies of men. The primary purpose of a state is to do violence. Some theoreticians define the state as the institution with the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. All states have some type of military or police which enforce laws. Second, states arise from society but seem to exist outside of it. Not all societies have a state. Throughout most of human history, communities were self-governing. They themselves made the laws they had to follow. However, a state isn't subject to direct community control. State violence isn't violence done by the people, but instead on the people. State law isn't made by the people, but imposed on the people. Even if aspects of the state are democratically controlled, people are still subjected to state power whether they want to be or not. However, even though a state acts like an outside force imposed from above, it still originates from within society. In societies with a state, the state is an important factor of that society's day-to-day functioning. Internal social forces bring the state into existence and allow it to continue existing. Chief among those social forces is class. Third, the state exists to allow one class to suppress and control another class. All states occur in class-based societies. If a society doesn't have class distinctions, there will be no state. The ruling class out of all the classes exerts near total control over the state. The state and its violent enforcers serve to keep the ruling class in power and to cater to the material interests of the ruling class. For example, the ruling class in a capitalist society like the United States is the bourgeoisie, who get their power from private property rights. We see how most politicians are bourgeois, and we see practices like corporate campaign donations and lobbying, which allow the bourgeoisie to exert even more control. We also see how the police spend most of their time targeting proletarians who threaten property rights, and very little time targeting capitalists who exploit and abuse workers. Dictatorship of the proletariat. A dictatorship of the proletariat doesn't refer to a dictator politician like Joseph Stalin or Augusto Pinochet. A dictatorship of the proletariat is a state over which the proletariat class has complete and total control. So it's actually more democratic, not less. The state in a capitalist society can be called a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, since the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, has complete and total control of the state. In a socialist revolution, the bourgeoisie are overthrown, and the proletariat becomes the new ruling class. An integral part of this process is the destruction of the bourgeois state and the creation of a dictatorship of the proletariat. The first step is dismantling the capitalist state. The proletariat cannot just seize control of the bourgeois state and use it to serve our own needs. The bourgeois state, because of how it's structured and the way it's run, is not set up to accommodate such a large and diverse ruling class as the proletariat. It just can't handle that intense level of democracy. This is where Marxists part ways with social democrats, who think the bourgeois state can be reformed into serving working class interests. We Marxists, of course, support efforts to reform the bourgeois state, but only as a temporary measure to relieve human suffering, not a long-term permanent solution. Next, the proletariat have to set up our own state designed to serve working class interests. One with very high levels of accountability, where all officials are elected, subject to potential recall at any time, and are paid no more than the average worker's wages. And we will need a state. We need a functional bureaucracy to manage the economy and to make and enforce law. We're also going to need those pesky armed bodies of men who can fight off any bits of the old ruling class who attempt to reassert their authority. Otherwise, they'll regain control, the whole revolution will be for naught, and the proletariat will be back at square one. This is where Marxists part ways with the anarchists, who believe all states are inherently reactionary and oppressive. And to be fair, a dictatorship of the proletariat, though 100% necessary, is oppressive, but it's far less oppressive and far more ethically justified than a bourgeois state. A capitalist state allows a small and parasitic minority to suppress the majority. A proletariat state does the exact opposite, oppresses only a small and parasitic minority while the majority enjoy democratic freedom. Of course, the dictatorship of the proletariat will not always exist. Once the old ruling class is completely and totally stripped of their power, class distinctions will completely disappear, which means the state will be rendered useless. This is where we get the phrase, the withering away of the state.
And that was 27 terms and definitions to give you a basic introduction to Marxist theory. Of course, there are many other things that we did not get to talk about in this video. We didn't get to talk about imperialism or monopoly capitalism or cultural hegemony or central economic planning. Topics that are actually a lot more interesting and complicated than they might sound on the surface, and things that I definitely think I should cover in future videos. However, hopefully this video introduced you to a new perspective of how the world works, and hopefully it gave you a foundation of background knowledge as you continue along with your political development. So if there was any topic we discussed that didn't make a lot of sense to you, or even if it was something interesting you would like for me to talk about in more detail, go ahead and let me know in the comments. and also make suggestions for any other topics you think I should cover. Thank you for watching.